Hello, and welcome to the Sustainable Remediation Forum December webinar. I'm Betsy Collins, and I'm currently the Vice President of the Sustainable Remediation Forum, and I'm really excited because we have a great speaker lined up for you today. I'm going to go ahead and flip to the next slide. I just wanted to introduce the Sustainable Remediation Forum to anyone who is not familiar with us. Since 2006, the Sustainable Remediation Forum, or SURF, has promoted the use of sustainable practices during the investigation, construction, remediation, redevelopment, and monitoring of contaminated sites, with the objective of balancing economic viability, conserving natural resources and biodiversity, and enhancing the quality of life in surrounding communities. If you'd like more information, the website is listed here. You can also follow us on LinkedIn or on Twitter. And from that website, you can also sign up to join our email list if you're not already on it. This webinar is the third in our 2019 webinar series, and I'm really excited to let you know that PDHs are available for today's webinar. At the end of the presentation, there's going to be a link to a survey if you're interested in getting these credits. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Melissa Harklerode. Dr. Harklerode is an environmental sustainability scientist and technical specialist for CDM Smith. She's a past at-large board member for SURF. She specializes in the development of innovative risk management solutions that maximize sustainable and resilient project outcomes. And with that, Melissa, take it away. We're excited to hear about the social side of sustainability.
Great, thanks so much, Betsy, and really excited to present on this topic today for our attendees. As Betsy alluded to, you do get PDH credits for this course, and there will be a web link at the end that you'll need to complete to get those credits. So for the social side of sustainability, to help frame this element of sustainable remediation, the material to be presented is categorized into the ITRC Green and Sustainable Remediation Planning Process steps, in which you see along the right-hand slide. So we're going to evaluate and update our CSM, establish GSR goals, talk about stakeholder involvement, and then dive into different tools, methods, best management practice, metrics, and so on that can be integrated into your GSR evaluation. So for the first step, that is to evaluate and update your conceptual site model, and this is usually performed at the site characterization and remedial investigation stage. For consideration of site-specific social factors within your site CSM, this is primarily achieved by determining which societal impact categories are applicable to your project. And I have subsequent slides that go over each of these impact categories. And then as well as identify who your stakeholders are. And that doesn't just include the community or impacted parties, but also regulatory agencies, responsible parties, developers, water purveyors, and so on. So when you're doing your environmental CSM, challenge yourself with expanding that to incorporate the social factors. You know, what are the potential impact categories that should be considered, and who are your stakeholders? So for the 10 societal impact categories, in 2015, the Sustainable Remediation Forum published 10 categories based on a literature review of international green and sustainable remediation frameworks. And the intention of developing these 10 social impact categories was for remediation professionals to use sort of as a checklist to assist in identifying and defining social indicators that are predominantly impacted by their individual site-related activities. And this is meant to be performed again at this planning CSM stage. And once you identify those applicable indicators, that will help aid your team in picking the applicable social metrics and evaluation tools. So the next couple of slides, we're gonna just touch upon each of those categories. So the first category is stakeholder collaboration, in which you want to identify beneficial and undesirable impacts from site activities, discuss perceived risk, develop future land use and design, and help aid in development of green and sustainable remediation goals and indicators to evaluate successful sustainable remediation. And we're going to touch upon the elements of stakeholder collaboration throughout this presentation. The second category is health and safety of site workers and the surrounding community. The third impact category is benefiting the community at large by promoting the community's quality of life. So this includes considering potential to increase property value, social and human capital, reuse of treated media and materials to meet community needs, and redevelopment of the property. Simultaneously, you want to alleviate undesirable community impacts as you're promoting, benefits to quality of life. You want to do this at the neighborhood and locality scale, including considerations for noise, traffic, odor, congestion, business disruptions, comprising local heritage and cultural concerns. The fifth societal impact category is economic vitality by contracting local vendors and resources, developing and investing in new skill training and education, and incorporating redevelopment into the remediation strategy selection. And then the sixth impact category is social justice during urban revitalization, where you consider the role of gentrification in redevelopment and design, and widen access to employment opportunities. The seventh societal impact category is regional and global societal impacts, such as long-term chronic public health impacts from chemical emissions and financial implications due to the generation of emissions as well as consumption of natural resources. The eighth societal impact category is value of ecosystem services and natural resource capital, in which restoration of ecosystems, hydrological functions, fauna, and indigenous flora habitat in a way that enhances local quality of life and otherwise address societal challenges. And then lastly, the last two societal impact categories are number 9, risk-based land management and remedial solutions to distribute resources in a manner to effectively address the site-specific human health, environmental justice, and community issues associated with contaminated sites. And then lastly, number 10, contribution to local and regional sustainability policies and initiatives, such as renewable energy initiatives, climate change policy, eco-job strategies, and regional land use policies. So again, just to recap, these 10 societal impact categories is just a good exercise for individuals to go through during the planning stage to determine, which societal factors or drivers are present at my site and how can that be considered as part of my remedy selection, remedies design, remedy implementation, and incorporating that as part of your conceptual site model um, and subsequent cleanup goals that we'll touch upon in a minute as well. In addition to the societal impact categories that you want to go through as a checklist during your CSM, you want to identify who your stakeholders are. And this is a really valuable exercise to identify what the role of a stakeholder is and how that stakeholder may influence project outcomes. And there's two tools that I would like to touch upon today. First tool is the is the actor linkage matrix tool in the upper left-hand side. This tool aids in understanding roles and relationships among stakeholders by defining the stakeholder network and measuring relational ties. And this is really helpful in identifying where you may have partners, such as what is shown with these straight lines here, or alliances with these double lines. And if you have a stakeholder relationship that may be broken or tense, you have the potential to build capacity with your stakeholder alliances to get those individuals to the table, or at least move forward towards consensus. So this is a really good way to kind of map out the roles and relationships of your stakeholders. A second tool is an interest influence matrix tool to assist practitioners to learn who's the most affected by site information and decisions, as well as their level of interest and influence. You're going to have stakeholders that have a lot of influence on decisions and are very interested in participating in remedy selection, design, and so forth. And then you're going to have stakeholders that have very low interest. They may have very high interest, but they don't really play a role in the decision-making process. And by categorizing stakeholders into these individual interests and influence categories helps refine what type of engagement or stakeholder involvement is necessary for each of these different stakeholder groups. So it's a nice way to kind of uh, map out your different stakeholders and how you want to go about potentially engaging with them. These tools help identify unengaged and disinterested stakeholder populations, needs for capacity building, developing a communication team, so who should be part of that team, and as well as targeting outreach resources in areas where relationship building is necessary. And this is all, think about it as a desktop exercise that you're doing during project planning to really best understand who your stakeholders are and how to best integrate social impact factors into your remedial decision making. So once we update our CSM with our social factors, it's time to establish GSR goals. That's the next phase in the ITRC GSR planning process. And when we define site-specific green and sustainable remediation goals, we're doing it in the terms of environmental, economic, and social elements. I wouldn't say that there are that this is primarily driven by the social dimension. So while you do this, I would say this is done in an effort in the lens of the triple bottom line. But from the social sphere, you're going to touch upon, redevelopment and end use scenarios, touch upon what was your findings by going through that desktop review of main societal impact categories and how that can be incorporated into a GSR goal. What are your assumed stakeholder expectations and needs? And I put assumed under here because right now we just performed, a simplified desktop analysis. We have not really engaged the stakeholders yet, but by your understanding of the site and collaborating with different players, you do have a sense of what those assumed expectations are. And then also resiliency and climate adaptation, which has a social element. And the primary purpose of developing green and sustainable remediation goals is to help communicate to the stakeholders how we're going about evaluating the achievement of sustainable remediation. It's really important to get buy-in up front, to get feedback from all impacted parties and stakeholders in developing your goals. So by going through this social CSM process and developing these goals is a good way to then interact with stakeholders to say, okay, these are our GSR goals that we came up with. Are you in agreement? And then you can start to brainstorm and recommend um, metrics and tools that you're going to utilize to evaluate sustainability. And in this presentation, we'll focus on the social lens. So the next phase of the ITRC GSR planning process is stakeholder involvement. Stakeholder involvement is a pretty complex process. And as part of the SURF 10-year anniversary paper, a conceptual stakeholder assessment roadmap was published. And the primary objective is to help remediation practitioners define the purpose and process of stakeholder involvement. And this goes beyond just community stakeholders because it has a particular focus on engaging stakeholders in defining the sustainability objectives. So for stage one, we're doing this at both the site investigation and the design stage. And the primary purpose of stakeholder involvement is to understand the sustainability objectives and values of the stakeholders. What are their particular needs and concerns for the site? What are their ideal outcomes when it comes to risk management and end use? Is their interest long-term or short-term? Are there drivers or barriers to engagement present is also a good thing to identify during stage one. Once you have an understanding of what stakeholder values and needs are, what drivers are present for implementing and incorporating GSR and what those barriers are, you can go ahead as a team and integrate those stakeholder values and needs into your remedy selection and design process. What's really important as part of stage two stakeholder involvement is that we then reach out to the stakeholders again to evaluate whether or not we successfully integrated their needs and values into the remedial design, the remedial selection. It's really important for us not to assume that we were able to integrate their feedback without asking them. So we want to know, does the vision of the remedial strategy align with community's values and objectives? Is this something everyone can live with? That, have we built consensus and acceptance? And be sure that stakeholder expectations are in alignment with each other. And you'll do that primarily during the assessment and the final design stages. And then lastly, you just have ongoing communication here in stage three until site closure to keep stakeholders informed and engaged of the risk management strategy. And then, again, the purpose of this roadmap is to help define as a project team how you want to involve stakeholders during different stages of the project lifecycle. And once you have the purpose defined, that helps you determine which methods and tools are best to utilize. There are a variety of methods and tools that can be used. I would say that a good rule of thumb is to use multiple modes of engagement and stakeholder involvement tools as we are interacting with a heterogeneous community as well as a variety of stakeholders. Each of us on the phone probably retains information utilizing different modes. Some of us, read fact sheets. Other of us like to watch videos. Some of us need to have it be interactive. And if we truly want to get all stakeholders involved and understand their needs and concerns, it's best to use multiple modes of involvement and engagement. The following slides, I have a handful of tool examples to touch upon. So for surveys, they are a relatively inexpensive tool since it's primarily, paper. Sometimes you could do postal, but it's really great to get out and do in-person canvassing. And you can gather information on stakeholder values, needs, concerns, and their knowledge base in terms of risk management. Multi-criteria decision analysis is another tool for stakeholders to place weightings on the relative importance or level of achievement for meeting site-specific green and sustainable remediation goals, in addition to other cleanup objectives. There's a lot of different MCDA tools out there. Some of them are desktop based, some of them are web based, so that stakeholders can log in to an internet website and place weightings on different sustainability indicators and metrics. And then some companies and individuals have proprietary tools that have a little bit more capabilities. The Social Sustainability Evaluation Matrix is a tool that was developed by Dr. Krishna Reddy at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And this is a rating and scoring system tool in which key measures of social impacts under 4 categories, and these 4 categories are defined as social, socio-institutional, socio-economic, and socio-environmental. Excuse me. Um, and then you place either a negative or positive scoring on key measures under each of these different 4 categories to come up with an overall score for a social category, and then eventually a grand score that can be um, illustrated as this bar graph here, where it's looking at different remedial technologies and how these technologies scored um, based on the social sustainability matrix. Excuse me, I need to drink some water. I'm fighting a little bit of a cold. So this is an example of the SEM tool and key measures that are listed under the socioeconomic dimension category. For each of these individual key measures, a stakeholder can rate whether or not there's a positive impact and if that positive impact's ideal or improved. If the impact is not applicable or the key measures is not applicable to the site, or if it has a negative impact, if site activities have a negative impact on these key measures and the severity of that negative impact illustrated or represented by the -1, -2. And this is a publicly available tool as well. It's Excel based and anyone can utilize it. Another tool is a design charrette. This is an exercise for stakeholders to build towards consensus on, on allocation of different technologies and the footprint of those technologies, help define different end use scenarios, look at different design elements, and it's a good way to get individuals to write down their thoughts, but also any compromise that they've made in applying different technology footprints in certain areas or defining end use scenarios in different areas. And then you can put that up on the wall and talk through it as a team and kind of use that as a working contract to move forward with. Okay. So the next step is selecting metrics, GSR evaluation level, and boundaries. And as you might have picked up, we kind of have been doing that all along. As we're looking at the societal impact categories and developing our GSR goals as we're starting to reach out to stakeholders, that is inevitably aiding us in what type of metrics and what level of evaluation is most appropriate and applicable for this project. Now, and that's what's shown here in these blue arrows, that these three beginning steps feeds into this fourth step here. Now, it's important to note that, this is really not a linear process as it's shown here, as we've come to understand, especially with more complex sites and more complex CSMs. And stakeholder involvement, is a continuous process throughout the project lifecycle, as we saw in the roadmap. So as we're performing stakeholder involvement, we're getting a better understanding of what green and sustainable remediation goals are applicable and achievable. And we're also updating our CSM, which may change our role in stakeholder involvement, right? Simultaneously, as we're involving the stakeholders, we're picking up on, their additional values and concerns and needs that change throughout the project lifecycle. And that's also going to change the type of metrics and evaluation tools that we use. So this is really a continuous process. But I think going through the initial 3 steps to at least get a good plan down and understanding how your social conceptual site model is set up, that will just aid in continuously revisiting that CSM and the associated goals and metrics and tools that you decide to implement. So there are some additional metrics and tools that I wanted to touch upon, and these really are speaking to when stakeholder involvement is limited, either because it's a site that doesn't really have a lot of stakeholders that are off property boundaries, um, or the community engagement is being performed, but being performed by a separate party. That doesn't necessarily mean we cannot evaluate social impacts and include that as part of our analysis. So some tools available include the ASTM standard guide for integrating sustainable objectives into cleanup. This is a really great resource in that it has a best management practice list very similar to the ASTM greener cleanup standard. Um, it's a comprehensive BMP list based on these different societal factors and variables you see here in this graphic. And it's a really great starting point to identify how you can best incorporate social sustainability in the lens of stakeholder values and use goals. Another type of tool which we commonly perform as remediation practitioners is doing a qualitative assessment of the relative community impacts based on our understanding of the site, impacted parties, and different technologies that are being considered. Um, for the social indicators, I think to develop this list, a really great start, again, is those 10 societal impact categories. And then you can break it down further from there, utilizing the ASTM BMP list. And once you kind of go through that exercise and you start engaging with stakeholders or engaging with your internal sustainable remediation expert, they can help refine and flush out site-specific social indicators. But this type of high-level qualitative assessment, is acceptable. It's better than doing nothing. And it's a good way to be transparent on how you're considering social impacts during remedy selection. You can take that qualitative assessment and uh, kind of expand it to incorporate other social metrics, right? So here we have this short-term impact, which is your relative community impacts from the three different alternatives. You can then look at this in combination with other social factors such as social costs, which we'll touch upon in just a bit, and time frame for redevelopment and completion of remedial activities. Then you can also look at this in terms of other GSR metrics such as environmental footprint reduction and resources lost, bring in the economic element of cost, as well as risk management, incorporate what is your overall risk reduction and how that achievement of risk reduction is um, coupled with achieving different GSR goals, or what is the relative impact to the social, environmental, and economic dimensions based on achieving that particular level of risk reduction. So this is just another way to just take that little qualitative assessment and incorporate it into a more comprehensive evaluation. Okay. So I did touch upon social cost metrics and tools. In the previous slides, I want to talk about that a little bit. So for economic valuation, which is your social economic benefit, it's really about how your particular remediation and improved land use has direct environmental um, benefits in the terms of, hydrological effects like stormwater management, carbon sequestration by reducing emissions, biodiversity rehabilitation, which can contribute to ecosystem services, and connecting these environmental benefits or externalities from um, performing remediation redevelopment and linking that to the beneficiaries. So linking that to the welfare of water users, carbon credit buyers, and welfare beneficiaries of ecosystem services. So that would be individuals that may be in the tourism or agricultural um, sectors. And and just highlighting that these are shared benefits between the individuals that are directly benefiting from these enviroeconomic social um, services due to remediation and improved land use. So what we do a really good job at is understanding the science, and now it's just a matter of incorporating the economics. And by doing that, you really need to perform stakeholder involvement primarily. Um, and if you're able to come up with a monetary value for these externalities, it is an opportunity to help show how you may be offsetting remedy costs. So to do these economic valuation techniques, it's usually necessary to do a survey. There's different types of techniques. One is, willingness to pay, where you ask individuals how much they're willing to pay for a particular program. Not that they are going to pay for it themselves, but it's a representation of how they value a particular program. You can ask them, what their perceived value is on different water quality or preservation and conservation end uses. Um, or if you are able to do any sort of reuse of site media, such as treated groundwater, we now took a waste and transformed it into a good. And that good now has a value, a monetary value associated with it, and that can be incorporated as an opportunity cost. I would say and that this area of integrating the social dimension of sustainable remediation is where we need our future research needs, and really working with environmental economists to bring in these types of assessments into our remediation projects. And it kind of sounds burdensome, but um, our stormwater infrastructure utilities do this a lot. They go through a economic valuation, a benefit cost analysis using these different techniques and literature publications, not necessarily going out and doing these surveys themselves, but utilizing what's available in the literature. So I think we have a lot of lessons learned we can take from the stormwater infrastructure community and apply it to remediation. For social cost metrics, you probably have heard me talk about this before. And these are monetary values that are associated with um, i- chemical emissions. That's my particular um, knowledge set on social cost metrics. And social cost metrics, they are developed by a couple of different agencies and individuals. The EPA does develop a social cost of carbon, and it was last updated in 2016. And what social cost metrics really represent is what are the financial implications that us as a society is going to endure for emitting these chemical emissions into the atmosphere. So as you can see in this slide, we're emitting CO2 in the atmosphere. This, contributes to um, climate change impacts and sea level rise. And thus, because we have sea level rise, we need to fund climate adaptation and resiliency adaptation measures. Similarly, if you were looking at other chemical emissions such as NOx, SOx, PM10, those social cost metrics are associated with the amount, the financial implications we endure as a society to help mitigate air quality impacts from those emissions. So these social cost metrics can be used to help in a very similar benefit cost analysis and normalizing environmental metrics such as greenhouse gas emissions, NOx, SOx, PM10 emissions, energy use into one monetary unit for ease of comparison. Okay. And then lastly, as part of this webinar, before we go into Q&A, I wanted to touch upon how to perform effective risk communication. That is an essential element of sustainable stakeholder engagement and social sustainability. So again, there is a planning process that has been developed to perform risk communication. I want to acknowledge that EPA does have a risk communication toolbox and guidance document. Recently, the ITRC team has developed a risk communication team that came out of the PFAS 1,4-dioxin and hazardous cyanobacteria teams. And we've been working on developing a risk communication toolkit and developed this communication plan process that was modified from New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection's establishing dialogue with the public. And as you can see, this planning process is similar to the GSR planning process in the ITRC document. It's similar to the stakeholder roadmap. It's really about getting a best sense of what your issue, your conceptual site model is, developing those objectives, understanding your stakeholders, and then again, determining what type of tools and strategies, messages, metrics you want to utilize to engage. So when we are engaging with the public and when we're formulating what our social drivers are, what our social metrics is, it's really important to um, acknowledge the role risk perception plays in how a community as well as other stakeholders perceive achievement towards a risk management strategy. So for quick definitions, risk is the relationship between you have a concentration of a contaminant, you have an exposure pathway present, and that has the potential to have human and environmental health impacts. Risk perception is more of how an individual perceives that particular contamination in the ground, in our environment, and the risk management strategy, and how they think they may be um, protected from the strategy that's put in place. And this is based on a variety of factors, including, their knowledge of site history and its contaminants, how vulnerable they feel to the exposure pathway. Do they feel they have the capability to respond to a hazard? Are they from an environmental justice community and so forth? And the reason I bring this up is because perception really plays a role in how a community accepts risk reduction measures, especially when they're involved and they play a role in participating in those risk reduction measures. So, are they responsible for getting a POET system installed in their house and maintaining that system? Are they responsible for participating and a lead prevention program that is established within their town? So all of these, how an individual perceives their risk to the contamination that is present is going to dictate whether or not they participate in a mitigation strategy, whether or not they accept that the mitigation strategy proposed is going to be protective for them. And stakeholder involvement, understanding community needs and values, everything we talked about earlier in this presentation plays into community acceptance for remedial action, operation, and maintenance. There is a sustainable risk management framework that is available to help identify site-specific social drivers and barriers and how to formulate that into secondary performance metrics to aid remedial practitioners communicate how risk management strategies are being successfully achieved. And this framework goes in on how to align these performance metrics with GSR goals. And then lastly, risk perception is going to play or is playing a major role as we're moving towards reuse of treated groundwater, especially in areas of the United States where we have severe drought issues. Also in areas of the United States where we have emerging contaminant issues and a water source is being utilized by the public. Um, in addition, reuse of treating groundwater also touches upon watershed management, trying to alleviate loss of a treated water source in the environment and utilizing that treated water to its maximum benefit instead of releasing it back into the environment. And as we do this, it's really important again to understand what community needs and values are, and integrating that into how you go about communicating reuse of treated groundwater and what type of metrics you want to utilize, to show that, to communicate and show to the public that the groundwater being treated is safe for consumption. So with that, I'm going to open it for Q&A. I hope we have lots of questions. I think we have about 10 minutes for Q&A, and then about 5 minutes before 2 p.m. I will hand it back over to Betsy, and she will show the PDH credit survey web link, touch upon upcoming SURF webinars, and give a thank you to our sponsors.
Thank you, Melissa. I just wanted to let people know that they can either unmute themselves to ask their questions, or they're welcome to type it into the chat bar, and then I can read it aloud, or you can read it aloud. While folks are typing their questions in, I was wondering, in your experience, what is the biggest obstacle, or maybe the most common obstacle that you encounter when you're trying to implement these social sustainability strategies?
I think the biggest challenge we have right now is not going through the GSR planning process, right? A lot of the time, at least from my experience and attending conferences, it seems like we are doing sustainability, um, and considering community impacts, um, without knowing what our social conceptual site model is and without establishing GSR goals. We kind of just look at the alternatives we have, do a qualitative assessment, present it to the public, and hope that we have integrated all their concerns, needs, and values without kind of maybe doing enough of our homework up front. Um, so I think for me, it's more of a we start a little too late in the process and in the project life cycle, but that doesn't mean you can't consider or start developing GSR goals or your social CSM when you're at the design stage. I mean, you can definitely do that. But again, you're starting from that process to make sure you're being comprehensive. And I find when you do that, then you are more successful in integrating sustainability and social sustainability throughout the entire project lifecycle because you already kind of kickstarted it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Haven't seen any questions come through the comment box, but I'll give people a chance to jump in on the mic if they are interested. Then I'll just keep going because I have lots of questions for you. People are gonna have to fill the silence if they've got one. I was also wondering, I know you've been, I mean, you're such an expert in this, and you've been doing it a while. Have you seen any change in recent years with maybe perception or approach, or has it been sort of static?
Approach to sustainable remediation or
Yeah, sure. Or I mean the social side, but if you've got thoughts on
yeah. I think we're talking about it more, which is good. And I do hear a lot when we go to conferences or we have a sustainable remediation panel, um, that it's still difficult to identify how to best evaluate social impacts and what is appropriate, how comprehensive do you have to be, and so forth. So um, that has been a consistent feedback that I continue to hear. So um, I don't know if we've had much change per se in implementing or incorporating social a little bit better. But I guess I would challenge those individuals to go through the GSR planning process with a social lens and going back to the societal impact categories, going back to those resources and kind of going through that exercise and see if you still end up with that same question of how do I go about even wrapping my hands around how to evaluate the social impacts and dimension. Um, and if you're still at that stage, let's talk. Because I think maybe not that we're in an aspect of trial and error, but I think we need to start putting the processes that are out there into action and seeing whether or not they work, because we won't know how to best fix those processes unless we start doing them and identifying what the challenges or data gaps and so forth may be present. Um, I don't know if that directly answered your question, Betsy, but that's
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And I
okay.
mean, it sort of, reminds me of like not just doing it, but then sharing the experience with other people, which, is part of the reason we wanted to put the webinars on, is just to provide folks another opportunity to share experiences so we can learn from each other.
Yeah, and I guess I would also say that's a really good point. Another aspect is I think a lot of the time we kind of focus on the community being the only stakeholder, when in reality, everyone's a stakeholder except for the remediation consultant. And um, when we talk about stakeholder involvement, when we talk about defining GSR goals, when we talk about figuring out what metrics and tools are appropriate, I mean, you really got to involve all stakeholder parties. And I think we've learned over the years that when we don't involve all stakeholder parties, when we kind of just do it as a consultant and a client, those analyses sometimes are not very well received because it didn't take in consideration the other stakeholder values and concerns, or um, didn't utilize the tool that wasn't appropriate for a specific stakeholder. So again, I really feel like it goes back to having a plan in place. Doesn't have to be anything comprehensive, but when we say stakeholder involvement, it's like getting the agencies, the regulators, the responsible parties, the individuals that have an influence, or even those that have high interest involved in that process. And when we do, it's super successful. Like the EPA Region 7 Leafs Award, the sustainability award that they provide, really highlights that when you get all parties involved in defining your GSR goals and understanding stakeholder needs and values, perception of risk management, you really come out with a great sustainable outcome. So if individuals are not familiar with that award, the Region 7 EPA Leafs Award, Google it, and there's a bunch of case studies on that website that really highlights when you do early stakeholder engagement well.
Thank you for that summary. I think unless someone has a burning question, I haven't seen any come through. I think that's a nice spot to end on. You did provide your email address here, so if folks think of a question later, or if you're watching this later on the webinar, I'm sure Melissa would be willing to answer any future future questions on the topic. It's clearly something you're really passionate about, and thank you again for such a great presentation and sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
If you want to go ahead to the next slide. So I just in the chat window put a link to a survey. The survey is super short. It just asks a few questions. And with that information, we can get you those PDH CEU credits. We're excited to have that opportunity. So please feel free to do that. Again, the link is in the chat window. Let us know if you have any issues with that. We've also put, again, the link to the Sustainable Remediation Forum website, which is sustainableremediation.org. If you just want more more information, that is available at the website. We also we have 2 webinars posted to our YouTube channel. There's an introduction to SiteWise and a discussion of the 10-year white paper that was published earlier this year. And the recording from today's webinar will also be posted to that channel. I was laughing because I just got a note that that maybe folks were trying to ask questions and they weren't coming through. So I might go ahead, Melissa, and get those emailed to you, and we can post the responses.
Okay.
Post those responses
Yeah,
when we
definitely.
post to the YouTube page, because we don't want folks to miss out on that. If you want to go to the next slide, I also just wanted to give a quick plug for some of the webinars that we already have lined up for 2020. In February, Rob Reppel from LT Environmental is going to be presenting some great case studies where they used solar-powered SVE systems. And then in April, we're going to be hearing about a SURF technical initiative on resilient remediation of contaminated land in Massachusetts. Those are both going to be really great webinars. If you were forwarded the meeting invitation by signing up for the Sustainable Remediation emails, you'll get future invitations. And if you have questions about that, please reach out to us through the website. And if you want to go to the last slide, last but certainly not least, I want to thank our sponsors. None of the work that SURF does we'd be able to do without their support. So thanks to all of them. And if you're interested in becoming a sponsor, that information is also available on our website. And so with that, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope you have a great day.
Okay, thanks. Bye. And we'll get
Awesome.
back to people on their questions as well.
Thank you.